There are few things more simple than Richard Dawkins' God delusion.
Yeah, no, as I said, makes me ashamed to be an atheist, I think was the phrase I used.
The American situation explains the rise of a new atheism.
Science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into...
9/11 was very, very significant. It began a program of gross simplification.
The main source of hatred in the world is religion.
The level of argumentation was not scholarly or academic or even evidence-based. It was simply sloganizing. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why many of the people who wrote essays for our book expressed their concern about this. We were encountering people who talked about the new atheism, in particular Richard Dawkins, moving them away from atheism.
There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life.
A number of the contributors singled out that bus episode. What is this? Engaging with Richard Dawkins rather like talking to a tape recorder. New atheism had little to offer by way of a positive alternative. They were unable to agree on a vision that held them all together. He said Mars left is so disgusted by it.
It's not every day that one atheist accuses another of cowardice for refusing to debate a Christian.
Dawkins failed to engage his critics properly.
The God Delusion is a very unsophisticated book intellectually. As a philosopher, I was just appalled at the arguments.
I'm busy.
A lot of people who were supporters and then stopped being his supporters, in effect said,
Hi, Justin here. Before we begin, would you like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God? I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. Go to justinbrierley.com or click the link in the info. Enjoy today's show. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Alister McGrath. Alister is the Andreas Idrios Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, and he's one of the editors of a new book, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. It's published by Kregel, and it tells the story of a number of adult converts influenced by Dawkins and the new atheism in their journey towards Christian faith. Alister, thanks for joining me today.
always good to see you, Justin.
You too, you too. Tell us firstly about this book. Tell us where the idea came from and how you managed to bring together this interesting, diverse range of converts.
Well, that's a very good question. Well, Dennis Alexander and I have known each other for many years, and we do talk about issues like science and faith and atheism quite a lot. And both of us began to notice we were encountering people who had either talked about the new atheism, in particular Richard Dawkins, actually being significant for their own faith trajectory, or perhaps moving them away from atheism because they were so disappointed by what they saw. So what we decided to do was to try and gather together 12 people who would not consult with each other. They would simply write on their own experiences from 7 nations. They're all over the place, very different stories. And what we found was we had 12 narratives of people who either found the trajectory of faith, their journey towards Christianity, was begun by new atheism, or catalyzed in significant ways, or they moved from a kind of nominal faith in Christianity to something much more robust. So we're not in any way critiquing either Richard Dawkins or new atheism. We're just saying, look, isn't it really interesting how, in effect, this has catalyzed a fresh interest in Christianity and led to some surprising outcomes.
Yes. I mean, what my response when I saw that famous bus campaign, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life," was, well, if you want to do anything to remind people there might be a God, it's to launch a bus campaign telling them there's probably no God. I feel almost like the new atheism was actually a bit of a gift to Christians in that way. I don't know if you'd agree, Alister.
I think looking back on it, we can say it is. And indeed, I have to say, a number of the contributors to our volume singled out that bus episode as, in effect, what is this? This is just nonsense, and made them begin to have doubts about the credibility of Richard Dawkins and the new atheism. So it's very, very significant. It was a complete misstep, a forced error on their part, unforced error, in fact. They didn't need to do this. But certainly, I think that what they simply did was really almost like hand Christianity a gift and saying, look, please walk through this gap we've created.
We'll come back to some of the individuals that you talk about in the book and that you introduce us to. Let's talk a bit about the new atheism itself, though. You write a very helpful introduction yourself in the book about really what you conceive to be the origins of this.
In what ways was new atheism then different from the forms of atheism that had preceded it? It's not as though new atheism itself hadn't existed before Dawkins and co came along. What was different about the way in which they were presenting it?
Well, a journalist called Gary Wolfe wrote an article about the New Atheist Church and coined the phrase the New Atheism, really to refer to the writings of Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. Christopher Hitchens hadn't emerged in 2006, it happened a year later, but basically Gary Wolfe, I think, summarized what for him were the two leading features of this new approach to atheism. Number one, it was very aggressive, very slogan-driven, and surprisingly inattentive to questions of evidence and argument. Really, it was sloganizing, religious people are fools, God's a delusion. It was assertion of ideas, often with a very bullying rhetoric. Unless you're a complete idiot, you'll see atheism is obviously right, but of course religious people are idiots, so what do you expect? And linked with this is a kind of demonization of religious people, not just a critique of religious ideas. In effect, saying religious people are idiots or fools or mentally ill, one of Richard Dawkins' less well-judged statements, I have to say. So that's one area. It in effect suddenly made atheism see invulnerable. This is the only option-thinking person. And linked with that is a second feature, which is absolute tone of certainty. This is obviously right. You don't need to think about this. Just relax. This is right. Buy into it. And in fact, Gary Wolfe, who wrote the article, said, look, these guys are really fundamentalists. They're just asserting their beliefs and not actually really giving people reason to think they might be right. So it's a very interesting movement, which in effect for a while held the high ground because the media found it very, very exciting and, of course, very, very novel, which, of course, was the intention of the slogan of New Atheism. But I think as time has passed, people have begun to rethink this in quite a big way.
I was going to ask as well, why did it come to the fore at the time that it did? You give a couple of reasons. I think that 9/11 was not insignificant, for instance.
I think 9/11 was very, very significant. And that, of course, is the event in New York in particular, where two planes were flown into the World Trade Center in September 2001. That really galvanized people. And in fact, 3 of the New Atheists said that's the trigger for our reflections. And in effect, it began a program of gross simplification. No suggestion that the reason why some people decided to fly a plane into a leading American target might be American foreign policy. No. It was all because of religious terrorism. And then it just became religion, kind of way it got simplified. Religion is what do. And Richard Dawkins would regularly say in his podcasts, in his public lectures,
science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings.
Scientists design planes, but only religious people fly them into buildings. So he really made this a major attack, but it's intellectually utterly superficial. I think that's one of the things people began to notice right there and then. This is in effect a slogan-driven, simplistically argued campaign. Is this really what intelligent, sophisticated atheists want? When, in effect, they've been trying to portray atheism as serious and sensible, these 3 guys come along and suddenly make it seem trivial and absolutely certain.
Another interesting element, I think, that was going on at the time the New Atheism came into the ascendancy was debates about creationism and intelligent design, especially in America, in schools and so on. And I got the sense that part of the impetus of the movement was pushing back against what they saw as, a threat to science. And obviously Dawkins and Dennett and Harris and others, that was particularly part of their shtick, that it was science versus the delusions of faith and so on. So just explain a bit about how that aspect of the New Atheism played into its popularity, especially in those early years.
Well, New Atheism is a very American movement, I have to say, that in effect its target is American Protestantism, particularly conservative Protestantism, or we might say fundamentalism. And that's one of the reasons why it received less favourably over here in the UK, because we don't really have these kind of forms of Christianity which are so intellectually lightweight and so dogmatic. But you're right, in many ways, the American situation explains the rise of a new atheism. There's this feeling that religious people are over-asserting themselves, and we need to rein them in. And the easiest way of doing that is ridiculing them, and in effect shaming them out of the public arena. What we need to do, the argument was to make these people embarrassed about their faith, and that way they'll simply retreat from any meaningful engagement with questions of public policy, like, for example, teaching evolution in schools. So it is a very significant agenda. I think what we have to say is that this Americanization of religion led to some very bad mischaracterizations of religion. For example, religion is defined as belief in God, but everyone knows that there are religions like Buddhism and various forms of Taoism which are simply not theistic at all. So there are a lot of very real problems here. What is the kind of religion that these guys are aiming for? Well, they say it's simply religion in general. That's the problem. But actually they're targeting only a narrow band of the religious spectrum.
And when it came to that strategy of using ridicule, how do you think that went? How effective was that, essentially as an evangelistic strategy almost for persuading people out of their religious beliefs?
I think initially it was very successful because it was rhetorically very highly charged. And, in effect, particularly, teenagers find themselves suddenly being exposed to ridicule and humiliation in high schools. In effect, you believe a delusion. You are sort of covert terrorist. You are an intrinsically violent person. Wise up, grow up. And that was actually very, very difficult for people of a susceptible age to cope with. I think that's one of the things New Atheism really has to answer for. But I think people are drawn towards simple statements of faith. And this is a statement of faith. I have to be absolutely clear. It's not right, and it's a gross misrepresentation, but a lot of people find it to be a very convenient misrepresentation. And that explains, I think, why so many people bought into this, at least to begin with. I think that the reason it attracted so much attention was it made for great newspaper copy and also for very simple headlines. The complexity of the normal kind of discussions that atheists and Christians would have is bypassed, and you go straight for the jugular and argue religious people are dangerous, deluded, and fools. We need to get them out of public life. Think, for example, of Sam Harris's op-ed piece in the New York Times, in effect critiquing Francis Collins being appointed to the National Institute of Healthcare and states, this man's Christian, he believes weird things, stop this. And that shows, I think, this growing public hostility toward people of faith resulting directly from this aggressive rhetoric of the movement.
Yes. I mean, given that sort of antagonism that marked some of the ways in which the New Atheists tried to put their point across, as you watched that from the sidelines and sometimes interacted with some of these folks, what were the sort of sense you were getting from your peers, your academic peers, who perhaps weren't so invested in that movement but didn't necessarily call themselves Christians? Were they cheering them on? Were they a bit critical of the movement itself?
Well, I didn't get very involved in this, I have to say, although I did do some things. But my concern was that the level of argumentation was not scholarly or academic or even evidence-based. It was simply sloganizing. I felt I'm not very good at that, so I don't really want to get involved. But certainly my atheist friends at Oxford University were really embarrassed. They said, look, please don't judge us by this sort of nonsense. They are not speaking in our name. There's a real reaction against it, which is why, interestingly, the New Atheism seems to have had its impact mostly outside the academic world. It's very interesting to observe where it had impact, and the academic world on the whole just felt this is utterly simplistic and doesn't really deserve serious attention.
I mean, you did write a response book to Dawkins. It was called The Dawkins Delusion. I remember Michael Ruse, I think, wrote the foreword for it. Do you want to explain who Michael Ruse was and his reaction to the New Atheism?
Yes, let me talk about that. My wife and I wrote a book called The Dawkins Delusion, and it was a very short response to Richard Dawkins. The reason it's so short is because his book is so academically insignificant that it's actually very difficult to get your teeth into what he's saying. But anyway, that our little book went on to be an international bestseller. Michael Ruse, a leading atheist philosopher, commend it, saying, look, Dawkins is an embarrassment to atheism. Michael Ruse and I have been friends ever since. We've talked a lot about these things, and we have some very intelligent conversations, and he continues to make it clear these guys are kind of weirdos. They're on the fringes of academic atheist culture. Now, that does need to be said, I think. But the problem is the real debate was happening at the cultural, not the academic level. And that's why I think it was so important that so many people began to emerge who were willing to take on Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and say, look, this is simply nonsense. This is not what we believe. Your arguments simply do not make the points that you think they do. And also, the only way in which you're able to make these points is by simplistic misrepresentation of alternative positions. I think that's a very important point. In my books, one of the points I make again and again and again is that Richard Dawkins and his colleagues use criteria to judge religion that they decline to apply to their own beliefs. In other words, there's a gross asymmetry in terms of the evidential basis of beliefs. And if you apply the kind of criteria they apply to religious people to their own beliefs, you shouldn't be holding these.
Give one example of that. I'm just fascinated by that, Alister. What sort of areas did you see there was this double standard happening when they judged Christianity versus atheism?
Let me give you one very simple example, because it is a very good question. Dawkins says to religious people, prove there's a God. Do a scientific experiment to prove there's a God. Well, anyone would say, well, look, okay, fair's fair. You do the same for your beliefs. Oh, mine isn't a belief. Anyway, you can't prove a negative. So in other words, he's saying, I don't have to prove my worldview because it's so obviously right, and I'm a very intelligent person. You idiots believe these things, and never you've got to show why they're right. The burden of proof lies on you. Well, I'm sorry. In an argument, it is an equal burden of proof. Both sides have to show that there are reasons for thinking that they are right. And Dawkins and Hitchens, I think, just had this absolute assurance they are right. And they don't need to prove their views. They're just obviously right that an intelligent person will see that immediately. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why many of the people who we interviewed for our book, or who wrote essays for our book, expressed their concern about this, because they were so concerned about the arrogance of the new atheist movement and the absence of good evidence for their positions.
And I think in that sense, although it may have initially drawn them a crowd, the kind of very, sort of arrogant and sort of ridicule sort of approach to new atheism, I don't think it really helped them in the long run, because I don't think for people who do hold faith, as an important thing, I don't think just making fun of them is the best strategy, in my view, for actually persuading someone out of their beliefs. Sure, give a good rigorous argument and you might get somewhere, but simply kind of making fun of them, I think, tends to actually entrench people in their beliefs rather than persuading them out of them.
Well, I think it was a very serious misjudgment. At the time, in the short term, tactically, it was probably quite a good idea, because it got them newspaper headlines and also made sure that they appeared on radio shows and TV shows and so on, because it was simplistic and simple. People could understand this very, very easily. As time passed, of course, people began to say, actually, really all you're doing is ridiculing. You haven't actually given us good reasons for these beliefs. You have these very low-level arguments, which actually are evidentially very, very precarious, I have to say. And I think there was a growing realization that actually this gave the impression that atheism is simply a position that ridicules alternatives, doesn't understand them, and that their best argument is to laugh at something rather than try and understand it.
Mock them, ridicule them in public.
And I think it should be religion treated with ridicule and hatred and contempt.
So I think that it created a very bad impression, not necessarily about atheism, but about these particular atheists.
Hi, Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you want to support my work, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get signed copies of both my books and the chance for monthly catch-ups. The links are with the info. And now, back to where we left off.
What about some of your own interactions with some of these figures? For instance, Daniel Dennett, one of the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism. I think you were involved in a sort of dialogue event that featured him at one time. Alister, what was your takeaways from that? Well,
that's right. Daniel Dennett and I debated at the Royal Society of Arts in London on his book, breaking the spell. And I simply made the point that actually all we find in that book is sort of vague assertions. Maybe there's a kind of God spot in the brain, or maybe there's a kind of sweet spot somewhere which resonates with God, or ifs and maybes, don't really know. But each of these is treated as if it's a certainty. And also, I mean, Dennett buys heavily into Dawkins' idea of a meme, something that infects your mind. And his argument is simply, well, of course, religion is a kind of virus of the mind that infects you. But of course, the key question is, I mean, isn't also atheism potentially a virus of the mind as well? So it's a very unsatisfactory encounter, because there was an evidence-free zone as far as I could see. And most of the audience I know from correspondence went away thinking, oh dear, this is not good for the new atheism. It kind of got off to a very bad start.
I remember there was a book that came out based to somewhat on your interaction called, I think it was The Twilight of Atheism. But that's a very kind of bold statement to make, that we may be seeing atheism in its death throes almost at the end of its days. I mean, what would lead you to make that kind of what would lead you to that thought that we actually atheism, the new atheism, may be a kind of sign that atheism may be even on the way out, in a sense? Well,
we have to be cautious about these things. I did write the book Twilight of Atheism, and I made the point that actually the future of atheism really didn't rest with atheism, but with whether religious people did stupid things or not. In fact, and if religious people were unwise and did silly things, then that would in effect increase public interest in atheism. And of course, 9/11 did precisely that. So it is a reminder that there are two things going on here. One is the way in which religious people are judged culturally, and the other is, of course, the arguments for belief in God and atheism, and these get connected. So that's why it's very, very important for religious people and religious groups to kind of work on their public images, which I think as we all know, needs an awful lot of attention at the moment. But I think that one of the points I was really trying to bring out was that it's very, very hard to say it's simply a matter of arguments. Actually, there are other things going on at the moment which make people feel that this position might be right, or make them feel this position might not be right. I need to be aware there's a deeper argument going on at a more emotional level than simply intellectual arguments.
You also interacted with Dawkins a few times over the years. I remember at the time that his God Delusion book was coming out, there was an accompanying TV series called The Root of Evil, in which he essentially made the same sorts of arguments for a Channel 4 documentary. And that featured him having a conversation with you, and I think you met once or twice in other situations. What have been your personal feelings as you've had those engagements with Dawkins himself? How has he come across? What's been the nature of the conversations you've had?
Well, maybe it's me. Maybe this is all my fault. But I found engaging Richard Dawkins rather like talking to a tape recorder. You know, I would raise a question and I get almost like a pre-recorded response, one that he clearly used many times before, failing to address the specific question I was asking and failing to, in effect, really realize the point I was making. So that was rather worrying. The other thing which, again, disturbed me slightly was that there's a kind of tendency to fix on the most ridiculous representative of a movement and then say he or she speaks to the movement as a whole. So it's ridiculous. And again, that's a point that many, many atheists have said in sheer embarrassment, you know, that in effect this is simply loaded and biased and it's not really doing us, i.e. atheism, any good. So my impression was that we were shooting past each other. We weren't really engaging each other because it was such a sort of stereotypical engagement.
You also make the point in your opening to the book, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, that in its way, the new atheism started to look suspiciously religious in some ways. Do you want to just explain how that manifested as the movement gathered steam?
Well, this is one of the most interesting things about the new atheism. I mean, quite early on, I made the point, look, actually, really, you guys are just giving us a different faith system. And that they will go, oh, no, we're rejecting faith. Now I'd say, well, then prove your beliefs. Oh, we can't do that. No. But they're right. And the point is that they're just asserting beliefs, hoping we'll accept them. It's about, I believe this is right, but I haven't actually shown this right. So the point I was making is these guys are really bringing home to everyone that atheism is a kind of faith, which didn't go down very well with them, but everybody else saw the point. But the real points that emerged were actually more significant. They're much more to do with the question of the way in which religions behave. And certainly the religions that, for example, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens want to critique are those that say we have an infallible text and we have infallible people who can tell us what is right. And I and many others, I have to say, made the point that actually New Atheism sounded awfully like infallible prophets saying this is the way things really are, trust me. And then books like The God Delusion or God is Not Great, both being treated as infallible by their readers. I remember once I went to speak at the bookstore in Oxford, and the previous week they'd had Richard Dawkins in to promote his God Delusion, and the bookstore manager said to me, Alister, it was really interesting. When people left that meeting, they were clutching this book to their breasts as if it was some kind of talisman that warded off evil or something. It was astonishing. And I think that here there's one of the real problems that, in effect, as ex-New Atheists have pointed out, P.Z. Myers is a very good example of this. It just says, look, this is where everything went wrong. One of the things was that, in effect, it almost became impossible within the New Atheism movement to critique either its leading representatives or its leading text, because to do so was to be seen as a kind of apostasy or critique of the movement's great leaders, a bit like a situation in North Korea. And that, I think, is really important because, in effect, it's morphing into something that's more than just a kind of critique of religion. It's an alternative version of religion which demands obedience, compliance, and, in effect, submitting yourself to the wisdom of certain sages who have to say to be decidedly fallible.
And I noticed that myself, that when people that perhaps they considered to be their sort of, peers and secularists went kind of off script from the sort of naturalist, materialist sort of thing. So, for instance, Thomas Nagel, a philosopher, an atheist, not a Christian, published a book called Mind and Cosmos, essentially asking whether there might be some kind of purpose within the universe just because of certain aspects of its teleology, fine-tuning, consciousness, and so on. He was always seen as a heretic, to use the religious language, by Dawkins and Dennett and Harris and so on. So it felt like even just sort of asking questions outside of that sort of materialist framework was seen as somehow, out of bounds in an almost, as you say, religious way.
Well, that's right. There's an authorized script. If you depart from an authorized script, you're out. It really became very exclusive. And the question that P.Z. Myers, who again left the New Atheism because he's so disgusted by it, raised was, who appointed these guys the four leaders of the movement? And how did that happen? It was a disastrous choice. Well, the answer is simply that they achieved a significant media profile. In effect, really the media decided there was this coherent movement called the New Atheism, and these four guys were its prophets. And in fact, they had not all that much in common, I have to say. But basically, it was a serious misjudgment, I think, and the unwillingness to tolerate debate and discussion of what were actually some very important philosophical questions, as Thomas Nagel pointed out very clearly, actually was seen as a sign of weakness. They don't want us to talk about these things because they've got something to hide. And again, that planted the seeds of doubt in a lot of people's minds.
So I've also noticed, and in my own book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I sort of tell in the first chapter the rise of New Atheism and the fall of New Atheism. And I reference exactly those quotes that you do from P.Z. Myers about the way he saw the movement kind of come unstuck in various ways. And in a way, it was because some of these key architects were actually starting to disagree with each other. They sort of, once they'd all agreed God doesn't exist and religion's bad for you, it felt like they couldn't really agree on anything else. A lot of sort of rancor and disagreement about what direction this movement should go in and so on took place. I mean, what's your reading of what happened? Why do we now refer to New Atheism almost in the past tense? Why did it lose its sort of intellectual or at least popular kudos that it enjoyed at one time? Why is it no longer what it once was?
Well, I think there are three reasons. Let me mention what they are. The third, I think, is the most important. The first of them is that it failed to gain traction in the mainstream atheist academic world. People felt this is simply lightweight. This is an embarrassment. A very good example is philosopher John Gray. his recent book, 7 Types of Atheism, which is actually a very, very good book, talks a lot about very serious, intelligent kinds of atheism. But the first chapter is about the new atheism, which he says is just a joke. It's a form of entertainment. It is not to be taken seriously. It doesn't understand religion. It doesn't know anything about history. So you can see that's very significant, because if a popular movement has no academic foundation, well, it's not going to last. The second point, I think, is also really rather important, and that is that in many ways it failed to gain traction because of the clear failure to take religion seriously, to try and identify what religious people thought, and also, I think, failed to engage with what religious people actually thought, instead presenting religious people with a predetermined package chosen by the new atheism. This is what you believe, and it's ridiculous, but they were not consulted about this. But thirdly, I think this is probably the most important point to make, that in many ways, new atheism had little to offer by way of a positive alternative. In other words, if you say there's no God, you say, okay, but what are you offering instead? What is your vision of life? Well, it turned out to be simply, there is no God. And as you rightly say, they were unable to agree on a vision that held them all together. They each had their own personal visions, which were going in all sorts of political and social directions, but there was no coherence to the movement. So really, it couldn't survive.
The surprising rebirth of belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Now you can listen to all of Season 1. Discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of new atheism. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
It did feel like, for a time at least, there was this hope among the new atheists that simply science and reason, that was the mantra. That was the way in which we would solve society's problems. But it almost felt like that was almost where their faith lay. There was this faith that if we just all submit ourselves to science and reason, then all the problems in culture will magically right themselves and so on. Obviously, life is far more complex than that. So as a scientist yourself and someone who, wants to engage in reason, why were those two things alone not able to do what the new atheists hoped they might do?
Well, the new atheists presented such simplistic accounts of both human reason and science that any intelligent person could see there was a serious problem here. For example, look at Christopher Hitchens' book, God's Not Great. The final chapter is a plea to go back to the 18th century Enlightenment because they got things right there. Well, you see, any scholar will tell you, look, we don't do that because we now know these things got this wrong. They failed to take account of the limits of reason. They failed to take account of the diversity of reason across cultures. So in effect, they were appealing to a false universal to give the grounds of certain beliefs. And then their account of science is alarmingly inadequate. In effect, science is treated as, in effect, delivering a set of uncontestable certainties. But any historian of science will say to you, no, science may be able to say this is the consensus today, but we don't know what the consensus is going to be tomorrow because science is on a journey and it changes its mind. Rightly so, as theoretical interpretation develops and as more evidence becomes available. So the concern was that they were, how shall I put it, simply reading reason and science in their own distinct ways for their own distinct agendas, and these did not match up with the realities out there.
As we draw this to a close, Alister, tell us about some of the specific stories then of the people who perhaps were noticing similar things as you were noticing as they encountered. Do you want to maybe mention one or two of the stories and give a brief summary of some of the different accounts that are included in the book?
I don't want to go too much. I don't want to spoil things, if I can put it like that. But I'll mention some themes in the essays. For example, one American scientist who opens the conversation makes the point that actually, like Dawkins, he loved science, but he was just appalled by the misrepresentation of science we saw in Dawkins' works, and also the tone of his writings. I mean, that was really quite alarming for him. Others would say that there's a very real concern, which made them begin to have major doubts about the new atheism, because it seemed on the face of it so right, and yet when they began to say you don't need religion to guarantee good, science reasonable to do this, but then Dawkins gave inconsistent accounts of how morality could be based on science or reason at various points in his work, and this particular person began to realize that Dawkins actually could not justify these approaches to ethics, that it was really quite a significant problem. Others made the point that actually the thing that alienated them was the tone of certainty that ran throughout these, particularly in Dawkins and Hitchens, whereas it's quite clear that there were certain things we just could not know for certain, but these guys in effect seemed to suppress any element of ambiguity and doubt, and that made them, in effect, if I can put it like this, very simply, stop trusting these guys. These guys are not, in effect, giving us a reasonable account of the way things really are. I need to look elsewhere. One thing that stood out for many people in this collection of essays is that Dawkins failed to engage his critics properly. And the name of William Lane Craig is mentioned by several contributors who wondered why on earth Dawkins did not debate him. Because, in effect, William Lane Craig, in my view, was one of the most concise, acute critics of Dawkins.
On pages 157 to 58 of his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins outlines or summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And when you look at this argument, the conclusion to which is, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, it is a patently logically invalid argument. Even if you grant all 6 steps in the argument, the conclusion doesn't even follow.
If Dawkins is a rational person, it would be impossible for him to say that this argument is not invalid, because none of the rules of inference will allow you to derive the conclusion from the statements. So I suspect what he would have to say is, well, I wasn't trying to be a philosopher here. This is a popular level book. I could tighten up the argument if I wanted to. And then I think we have to simply invite him to do so.
And Dawkins, of course, who doesn't really know very much of philosophy, refused to debate him.
I'm busy.
That was seen as a kind of strength by his supporters, but I think a lot of people who were his supporters and then stopped being his supporters, in fact said, look, if you aren't going to engage your critics, informed critics particularly, then you've got something to hide. And I think we need to look at your own views rather more closely. And I think that really that was a loss of confidence in the authority of these 4 writers who increasingly began to feel are kind of way propagating ideas without taking alternatives seriously.
Yes, I think that's right. I think once you got past the rhetoric, you found that there wasn't necessarily as much intellectual foundation there as was being claimed for the movement. I mean, obviously, it's very encouraging, I think, for many Christians to read accounts of people who have come to faith and so on. But at the same time, even though we acknowledge that to some extent the new atheism is a sort of thing of the past, we still live in a largely secular culture, a culture that has, to some extent, been very influenced by the new atheism. There's still a general, degree of skepticism towards God and religion and so on. And while most people probably don't think of themselves as dogmatically anti-theists, most people in our culture are probably somewhere on the scale of agnosticism and atheism. What do you think's next? What I suppose, in the absence of that sort of more dogmatic form of atheism, what are we seeing in our culture, and what can the church do to present its claims, I suppose, more compellingly, perhaps with, perhaps new atheism has helped us to do that, to hone our thoughts and thinking in this regard. But what can the church do for those who do find themselves still sceptical or even just disinterested in the topic of religion today?
Well, I think there are several things we can learn. I think one of the things that the new atheism did bring out was the failure of religious institutions to live up to what they claim to be basing themselves upon. And I think it is an ongoing concern because, if you judge Christianity by some of our churches, I think you may find yourself slightly worried by the outcome of that. But I think what we can say is this highlights the importance of individual Christian believers to talk about their faith, to in effect saying, this is why it works for me, this is the difference it makes, and try and personalize it and say, look, I'm not talking about institutions here. Every institution goes wrong. But I want to talk about my own faith and the difference it makes to me. So I agree to empower individuals, lay individuals, to talk more about their faith. But the other thing which I think came out very, very clearly is the degree of misrepresentation and misunderstanding in the New Atheism is very significant. And very often I think religious people find themselves, if I put it like this, pressurized into agreeing to certain things because they didn't know enough about their own faith, their own tradition, to say that's simply not true. I think that we really do need to recover a good public understanding of what Christianity is all about. I mean, at the moment, it's almost as if the New Atheism is writing the syllabus for the media about what religion is and what's wrong with it. And we do need religious people to get involved in this in quite a big way. But I think the most important point is simply to say that the best defense of Christianity is to explain what it really is. Because there are so many stereotypes around, and what each of us can do in our own way is say, let me tell you how I understand Christianity. Let me tell you the difference it makes to me. I am sure you're hearing other things from different people, but listen to me. I'm your friend. This is what I'm telling you.
It's been great to catch up, and thank you for explaining the book, giving us a rundown really of the history of the New Atheism and your own engagement with it, Alister. And I look forward to reading the accounts in this new book. Again, if anyone would like to pick it up, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. It's published by Craigle. I'll make sure there's a link to where people can get hold of the book from this interview. But thank you so much for highlighting these stories and giving your own account in the book of this movement, Alister. And it's been great to catch up with you.
Justin, it's always good to talk. Thank you so much for having me.
Would you like to hear one of the conversion stories from Alister's book, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins? Click to watch my interview with historian Sarah Irving Stonebreaker next. And you can visit justinbrierley.com for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving. Supporters can get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. That's justinbrierley.com.